Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling a really important area, understanding mental health, but through critical lenses, focusing on social justice. We've gathered a range of writings, insights from activists, academics, people with direct experience.
And for you, our listener, the idea is always to help you get a solid grasp of complex issues, but, efficiently.
Right.
Think of this as your direct route, sort of, to understanding some pretty fundamental challenges and maybe alternative ways of thinking about mental health.
Exactly. Our mission here in this deep dive is really to unpack how social injustices actually shape mental health policies and, well, everyday practices too. We'll be exploring different ways to understand emotional distress and what some people call mental difference.
And the sources we're drawing on offer a real mix of critical viewpoints, don't they? Like
Yeah.
mad studies, intersectionality.
Yeah, feminist, decolonial, queer theory. It's quite a range.
Sure.
Okay, so let's start to unpack this.
Well, it's probably worth remembering that how we understand mental health hasn't always been the same. It's shifted.
Definitely.
We've seen a real move, haven't we, from purely biological explanations towards ones that really bring in social factors more significantly.
Absolutely. So the first area we're diving into is that challenge to the standard biomedical views.
Right, the dominant view.
Some of our forces really push us to question how we use terms like mental health and mental illness. Like maybe we use them without thinking enough about the power dynamics involved.
Some writers suggest psychiatry can function almost like a ruling regime, defining what's normal and abnormal.
That's a strong claim. It gets you thinking.
It does. And what's really interesting here is this idea of counter-knowledge that comes from these critical perspectives.
Counter knowledge.
Yeah. It suggests that emotional suffering, mental difference, they're not just individual biological problems. They
Yeah.
happen within these much bigger contexts: historical, structural, cultural,
Political, too.
political, exactly. Which completely changes how we might understand these experiences, doesn't it?
Right, because the standard biomedical approach often says, basically, that all emotional suffering comes down to disorders.
And that mental illness is a huge cause of disability globally. There's research cited to back that up, emphasizing medical interventions.
But then you also have, say, the British Psychological Society in 2013. They called for a pretty big shift, didn't they?
They did, a paradigm shift, they called it. They pointed out significant conceptual and empirical limitations in diagnostic systems like the DSM and ICD.
Suggesting we need to move away from seeing everything as a disease.
Essentially, yeah. Which links to that idea.
Yeah.
You mentioned power dynamics. It's like science and society are constantly shaping each other.
Yeah, validating each other. Pickersgill talks about that, how intertwined they are.
Precisely. And that leads us straight into the issue of social injustice in mental health.
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty stark picture here, unfortunately. How people labeled as mentally ill have been and still are treated almost like non-persons through fear, prejudice, stigma.
Criminalization, even brutalization in some cases.
It's disturbing. And the discrimination they face in just basic areas of life: housing, jobs, education.
Yeah, and interactions with the police, the courts.
Yeah.
It's pervasive. Plus, the coercive stuff, forced institutionalization, compulsory treatment in the community. That's a huge point of contention.
Foucault and others wrote extensively about this history.
Right. And what's really concerning, according to some sources, is that the inequities aren't just happening by accident.
You mean they're actively promoted?
That's the argument, that the state, even the helping professions, can perpetuate them through laws, policies, practices. It's a very critical perspective.
Okay, so against that backdrop, we see the rise of mad studies. Can you explain a bit about what that involves for listeners who might not know?
Sure. Mad studies, well, it's a field that looks critically at madness itself. It's psychiatrization. The process of being labeled and treated by psychiatry. And it focuses on the oppression, but also the agency, the resistance of people who identify as mad or have been psychiatrized.
So it came out of activism.
Very much so. It has roots in the mental patients liberation movement, people directly challenging psychiatric practices, sharing their own stories.
Right.
And a key idea is shifting the focus. Instead of seeing distress just as individual illness, it looks at societal oppression as a major cause. It reframes these experiences.
Right. Not just pathology, but maybe valid responses to an unjust world.
That's a central theme, yes. And it connects with critical disability studies, too, questioning norms around body and mind.
And valuing lived experience as actual knowledge.
Absolutely crucial. Lived experience is seen as a legitimate, vital form of knowing.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, shifting slightly, our sources also really emphasize social determinants.
Yes. Frameworks looking at social determinants show clear links, don't they, between things like your socioeconomic position, race, ethnicity, gender.
And mental health outcomes.
Exactly. It's
Right.
not all just about individual biology. Far from it.
And this is where intersectionality becomes so important, isn't it?
Totally. Crenshaw's concept is vital here. It helps us understand how these different parts of who we are, race, gender, class, sexuality, disability, they don't just add up.
They interact.
They intersect. They create unique experiences of oppression, of inequality, especially within mental health. It's not just one thing, it's how they combine.
It seems like maybe traditional social justice thinking didn't always focus enough on health.
That's a point some critics make, yeah.
Yeah.
Often centered on this idea of the autonomous individual.
Right. Maybe overlooking how much we depend on each other, how vulnerable we can be.
Exactly. And Iris Marion Young's perspective is useful here, too. She talks about social group differences, seeing them less as simple oppressor-oppressed groups and more as expressions of structural inequality, these deep, ongoing social patterns that reinforce disadvantage.
Okay, this is really painting a picture of deep systemic issues. Let's turn now to colonialism's impact on mental health. This feels incredibly important, maybe sometimes overlooked.
You're absolutely right. It's huge. Our sources dig into how colonialism and what some call coloniality, its ongoing effects,
Right.
how they've profoundly shaped mental health approaches globally. It's not just history. It's about the continued dominance of Western ways of thinking, the subjection of colonized peoples.
And we see specific examples like in India, where the courts pushed to close traditional healing sites.
And directed people towards Western psychiatric hospitals. It's presented as a direct dismissal of indigenous knowledge systems.
Which are seen by some, like Nanny, as forms of resistance, right? Preserving different ways of understanding well-being against this dominant Western model.
Precisely. It's about valuing diverse ways of knowing and healing.
That story about the St. Michael's residential school demolition in Alert Bay, it really brings home the lasting trauma, but also the resilience.
It does. It's a powerful reminder of ongoing impacts, which is why our sources stress centering indigenous research methods and ethics in mental health work.
Respecting indigenous worldviews and self-determination.
Exactly, like this study with urban indigenous youth in Kamloops.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, it showed their understanding of health was really holistic, culturally centered. And they highlighted how racism and intersectionality, race, gender, sexuality, deeply affected their well-being.
And the need for culturally safe healthcare.
Critically important. And it also reminds us, as Cannon and Sanseri point out, that indigenous presence in cities itself challenges colonial assumptions.
Okay, this leads us towards ideas around pathologization or depathologization and resistance. How do these critical views challenge how experiences get labeled as illness?
Well, the sources give some great examples. Take premenstrual changes. Culture plays a huge role in how aware people are of symptoms, how they interpret them. What's a problem in one place might not be seen that way elsewhere.
So it's not purely biological.
Not entirely, no. Resistance, coping, they're complex processes. Anger, for instance, might be a totally valid response to being overloaded with responsibility, not just hormones.
So the cultural context can even influence whether the symptoms are seen or how they're understood.
That's the argument. And you see similar things with experiences like transsexuality versus gynecomastia as explored in online communities.
How so?
Well, think about access to surgery. Gender-affirming surgery often requires mental health diagnosis,
Right.
whereas surgery for gynecomastia in non-trans men is usually seen as cosmetic. And online, trans men often resist the medical framing, just asserting their identity as men.
Whereas the men with gynecomastia might locate their suffering more in the everyday struggle with body image norms.
Exactly. It highlights who gets pathologized, how and why, and the different routes to support or acceptance.
It really does. Now, what about media portrayals? How has media historically shaped ideas about madness?
Chen and Chun's analysis of old Canadian documentary films from the 40s to the 60s is fascinating.
Yeah.
It shows how things shifted, away from eugenics after WWII, more towards social causes, and then increasingly the Psyche model, the medical view, took over.
And the DSM played a big role in cementing psychiatry's authority then.
Absolutely. And the films. full of gender stereotypes. Women's problems linked to jealousy, worry,
And men's.
boredom, high expectations, that sort of thing. And a big goal was promoting healthy personality to prevent social problems, encouraging people to seek expert help.
And they targeted young people specifically.
Mental health education to stop delinquency, deviancy, often reinforcing very specific middle-class Anglo values and even fears about homosexuality.
Do we see echoes of that today?
Definitely. The sources suggest parallels. The dominance of cyber views, the push for self-diagnosis and seeking expert help, the focus on producing conforming citizens, those themes are still very much around.
Okay, let's shift to social justice movements in action, like the NAOMI Patients Association, advocating around drug policy.
Right. Boyd, Murray, and the MPA themselves document this. There's a long history of challenging harsh drug laws, leading to things like drug user unions.
And Vancouver's downtown east side is a key site for this, both challenges and resistance.
Absolutely. The NAOI trial that was for heroin-assisted treatment, HAT, was pivotal.
And the NPA formed afterwards.
Yeah, when the trial ended, the participants organized to fight for continued access to HAT and for more ethical drug policies based on their own experiences.
The writings from their workshops sound powerful.
Incredibly. Personal stories, critiques of standard treatments, calls for basic peace and happiness. It connects directly to later trials like Salome and the ongoing fight for the rights of people who use criminalized drugs.
And finally, the sources look at arts-based research for social justice and mental health. What's the idea there?
The argument is that arts methods can capture things traditional research misses, especially around social location, intersecting oppressions. Art allows for expressing complex, embodied experiences of exclusion, things that are hard to put into words. It fits well with intersectional research.
Like the example of racialized women using art.
Exactly. Using creative arts to deal with cultural expectations, discrimination, and services. Their rebellion, their art, was part of their recovery.
So it humanizes experiences and gives richer data.
That's the potential. And the recommendation is clear: involve peers, people with lived experience and arts expertise in the research itself.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, this deep dive into these critical writings really underscores how deeply social injustice is woven into mental health systems and understanding.
It really forces us to look beyond just biology, doesn't it? To see the impact of social determinants, intersectionality, colonialism.
Hasn't seen the limits of just focusing on individual pathology.
And the power of lived experience, of resistance, and how critical approaches like MAD studies or arts-based work can push towards more equity.
So, for you listening, what does this all mean? Hopefully it offers a more, well, thorough and nuanced view of mental health, one that sees the individual within their social world.
Yeah. Which leads to maybe a final thought for you to ponder. How might these concepts, power, social justice, intersectionality, apply to your own understanding of mental health and well-being?
That's a good question.
And whose voices do you think often get marginalized or maybe even silenced in these crucial conversations?
Definitely food for thought. If you want to explore more, do check out the work of the scholars and activists we touched on today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.